I forgot Star Trek. DS9's Quark had the weirdest TNG Season 1 appearance. When most people think of Quark, the sharp-tongued, profit-obsessed Ferengi bartender from Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, they think of his smoky bar, his never-ending schemes, and his snarky banter with Odo. Quark became one of the most beloved secondary characters in Star Trek history, not only because of Armin Shimerman's performance, but because DS9 used him to both satirize and humanize Ferengi culture. He was greedy, corrupt, sly, and constantly looking for an angle, yet he also had a heart that slipped out in moments of vulnerability. But before Quark became a fan favorite, Star Trek, The Next Generation introduced Shimerman in one of the most bizarre ways possible. And unless you've revisited TNG Season 1 recently, you might have forgotten just how strange it was. In fact, Quark's first appearance in the franchise, long before DS9, is buried in a much-maligned TNG episode that presented the Ferengi in a way that was so wildly off-kilter, it almost tanked them as a species. Let's go back to 1987, when Star Trek was just beginning its bold new era, and when Quark, or rather his proto-version, was at his absolute weirdest. The Ferengi were supposed to be TNG's Klingons. When Star Trek, The Next Generation launched in 1987, Gene Roddenberry and his team needed a recurring villain. The Klingons had been elevated to uneasy allies after the events of Star Trek VI. The undiscovered country were still on the horizon, and TNG quickly locked Worf into the main cast, signaling that the Klingons were no longer going to fill the role of enemy of the week. So the writers created a brand new alien race, the Ferengi. They were imagined as the perfect contrast to the utopian values of the Federation. Where Starfleet sought knowledge, exploration, and diplomacy, the Ferengi sought only profit. They were ruthless capitalists taken to the extreme. Roddenberry even described them as 21st century humans gone wrong. It was a neat idea, at least on paper. Unfortunately, the execution in TNG's first season left a lot to be desired. And Armin Shimerman was right in the middle of it. Armin Shimerman's first Trek role, The Last Outpost. The first appearance of the Ferengi came in The Last Outpost Season 1, Episode 5. It was also Armin Shimerman's first appearance in Star Trek. Shimerman played one of the Ferengi leaders who confronts Captain Picard's crew in what was supposed to be a tense showdown. Instead, what audiences got was odd. Really odd. The Ferengi were introduced as cackling, hyperactive, almost goblin-like figures. They hopped around, waved energy whips, and spoke in exaggerated, squeaky voices. Instead of coming off as menacing, they felt cartoonish and unintentionally comedic. Imagine space leprechauns mixed with a little gremlin energy. That was the first take on the Ferengi. And right in the middle of it all was Shimerman, hissing his lines, baring his teeth, and trying his best to sell the bizarre direction the showrunners had handed him. To make things even stranger, the episode frames the Ferengi as a major threat, one that might rival the Federation. But by the end of the hour, they're more laughable than frightening. It's jarring to go back and watch this episode after seeing Shimerman as Quark in DS9. You can almost feel him straining against the performance choices, trying to inject personality into a concept that just didn't quite work. The energy whip problem. One of the weirdest details about the Ferengi in their debut was their weapon of choice, energy whips. While Klingons carried batleths and disruptors, and Romulans relied on sleek technology, the Ferengi pulled out glowing cattle prods that looked ridiculous on screen. The props didn't age well even in the late 80s, and paired with the Ferengi's high-pitched shrieks and exaggerated mannerisms, the result was more parody than menace. Shimerman himself has admitted in interviews that he cringes when he rewatches The Last Outpost. He knew immediately that the Ferengi needed a major overhaul if they were going to have any staying power. And in a strange way, that early disaster actually set him up perfectly to reinvent the species later on. How Quark saved the Ferengi. Fast forward a few years. By 1993, Star Trek, Deep Space Nine was launching, and the writers had a new opportunity. They wanted a Ferengi as part of the main cast, but not a parody villain and not a one-note capitalist. That's when Armin Shimerman returned, this time as Quark. Quark was everything the early Ferengi weren't: clever, layered, funny without being cartoonish, and most importantly, believable. He still embodied the profit-driven spirit of his species, but he had nuance. He could be ruthless, yes, but he could also be compassionate, especially when it came to his family or his unlikely friendships with humans and Bajorans. Over 7 seasons of DS9, Quark became the definitive Ferengi. And in doing so, Shimerman helped redeem an entire alien species that might otherwise have been forgotten after one failed appearance. The contrast between Quark and his original Ferengi role in The Last Outpost couldn't be sharper. Where the early Ferengi were little more than space jesters, Quark gave them depth, dignity, and relevance. Why Quark's proto-appearance still matters. It would be easy to dismiss Shimerman's first Ferengi role as just a footnote in Star Trek history. But in a way, that bizarre first-season appearance is an essential piece of the franchise puzzle. Without The Last Outpost failing so spectacularly, there might never have been motivation to refine the Ferengi. Shimerman himself has said that he used his embarrassment over that performance to fuel his determination to make Quark work. And Quark didn't just work, he thrived. He became one of the cornerstones of DS9. The show used him to explore big ideas about morality, economics, and the Federation's own blind spots. In many ways, Quark was more honest about human nature than the Starfleet officers around him. It all traces back to the awkward, almost unwatchable antics of the Ferengi in TNG's first season. It's living proof of how Star Trek learns from its own mistakes, reshaping weak concepts into something enduring. Revisiting The Last Outpost today. Watching The Last Outpost in 2025 is both fascinating and unintentionally hilarious. On one hand, you can see the raw ambition of TNG's early days. The show was trying to invent new mythology, create new villains, and push the franchise into the future. On the other, you see how clumsy those first attempts could be. Shimerman's Proto-Quark is barely recognizable as the character fans would later come to love. His voice is different, his mannerisms are exaggerated, and the makeup, while impressive for the time, wasn't nearly as refined as the Ferengi designs of the 1990s. And yet, for all its flaws, there's something charming about that early weirdness. Without it, we wouldn't have gotten the richly drawn Ferengi culture explored in DS9, complete with the rules of acquisition, Moogie, and the unforgettable sibling rivalry between Quark and Rom. From energy whips to the rules of acquisition, the evolution of the Ferengi is one of Star Trek's most dramatic success stories. They went from being laughable space goblins to a fully fleshed-out society with traditions, values, and contradictions. Quark is at the center of that transformation. His layered portrayal turned the Ferengi from a failed idea into one of the most unique contributions of DS9. And the fact that Shimerman himself played both the worst and best versions of the Ferengi makes the story even more poetic. It's almost as if Quark himself had to crawl out from under the shadow of those embarrassing energy whips. And in true Ferengi fashion, he managed to turn failure into profit. Conclusion: the weirdest Trek full circle moment. When I rewatched TNG Season 1, I had honestly